I always had my inhibitions about building larger scale models for the sheer size and the amount of work involved in creating them. But this is the first time I stepped out of my comfort zone and decided to build one. Welcome to my channel, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sherbir and this is the build review of the 48th scale Supermarine Spitfire Mk.VIII from ARII. Well, whatever it is, that doesn't really matter. Let's go ahead and take a look at what's inside the box. So as I open the box, I am greeted with a plastic bag with a set of sprues inside it. Going further in, we have the decal sheet or the decal sheet, which of course I wouldn't be using, and then the instruction sheet within the plastic bag. As I cut open the plastic bag with my X-Acto knife, I get the first sprue with the fuselage halves and the elevators, the second sprue with the propeller, the seat and other bits and bobs, followed by the third sprue, which is the clear sprue and has the canopy in a single piece, and then the fourth and last sprue, which has the wing halves. And here you can see the extremely detailed decals, but I won't be using them. And then we have the 4-page, very simplistic instruction sheet with 8 steps in total, and the paint and decal guide on the last sheet. So let's get on with the build then. This is sprue number 2, and you can see me cutting off the cockpit interior assembly, and that's the cockpit floor. This is the cockpit instrument panel. This is the seat support system, and I'm getting on with the removal of the flash that is left on the seat, and a little bit of sanding of the instrument panel with my sanding stick, followed by the assembly of the control column on the cockpit floor. And here you can see me assembling the remaining structure of the cockpit with the instrument panel, the seat support and the seat, and the final adjustments of the rudder pedals. This is sprue number 1, and you can see me cutting the fuselage halves from the sprues and cleaning them up with my X-Acto knife, following it up by a black primer and then airbrushing the interior cockpit green of the Spitfire cockpit. Once the cockpit was painted up, I began painting the cockpit instrument panel and seat structure with the same Fevicryl light green. And this was then followed up with a little bit of detailing inside the cockpit, and I used Fevicryl gold to highlight this center wiring system that goes across in the cockpit, followed by a little bit of more detailed painting using black, red and other colors from Fevicryl. Here you can see me detailing the cockpit instrument panel with Fevicryl black, and here you can see a little more intricate detailing using Camlin red color and some toothpick painting. I then measured the length and the width of the seat, and I wanted to create a seat cushion, so I used my usual Play-Doh to cut out and detail the seat cushions for the seat. The seat cushion was then installed within the seat tub, and you can see that it's come out really nice. I then went on to create the seat belts because the cockpit hardly has any details in the kit, so this would have been a much needed detail to enhance the look of the cockpit. So I created the seat belts using Tamiya masking tape, and finally assembled the entire cockpit structure within the fuselage. It was then time to add a little bit of Play-Doh inside the Spitfire fuselage because I wanted the Spitfire to have some weight when you hold it in the hand. So I used the regular Play-Doh, which is made by a company called Fun School, and this Play-Doh is non-residual, so it's also considered safe for children and it doesn't leave any residue. So once I added that Play-Doh, there was enough weight inside the Spitfire. I joined the fuselage halves together. And here you can see me cutting off the wing halves and starting off with the assembly of the wing section, followed by a little bit of cleanup of the flash that is left out. And then joining the upper and lower sections of the wings together. Once this was done, it was time to assemble the fuselage on top of the wings, and this just snaps together very nicely, and this was the best part that I liked in the kit. And then I added the elevators of the Spitfire, and it now has the general shape of the Spitfire. I then moved on to the general assembly of the other subsections, and here you can see me assembling the exhaust intakes on the underside of the Spitfire. Once the general assembly of all the parts was complete, it was time to start the most hated part in the build, and that is filling and sanding. So I started off by masking the areas that required filling and sanding, and I used my paper masking tape to mask off the edges that required filling. And then I used my trusted Comfill automotive filler and used a toothpick to apply it liberally over the areas that needed filler. And you can see there's a lot of filler that was required. And here you can see a gap of roughly 1 mm in the joint between the fuselage and the wing on the underside of the Spitfire, and I would have to reconstruct this using Fevicryl Mold It, which is a 2-part epoxy putty. I created a very thin layer of Fevicryl Mold It by joining the 2 parts, hardener and resin, together and adding powder onto it to dry it off, and made a very, very thin layer by pressing a round object on top of it and rolling it off. Once this thin layer was constructed, I placed the layer over the area that had to be reconstructed on the underside of the Spitfire, and here you can see me now doing some precision cutting to be able to accurately reconstruct that area and remove the excess that is not required. Once this was done and the Fevicryl Mold It had been drying for about 24 hours, I started sanding off the underside of the Spitfire with progressive sanding of 220, 400, 600 and 1200 grit sandpapers to make it a smooth area to work with. And then I primed the entire body of the Spitfire in black, and then started working on the colors that would be required on the underside of the Spitfire. And I've already had a video out on how I painted the underside of the Spitfire, so these are just some excerpts from that video that I've included inside this. I'll leave a link to that video below in the description. And once the underside of the Spitfire was done, I moved on to the upper part of the Spitfire and I started painting it with Fevicryl gray or light gray that I had earlier made by using black, white and a little bit of blue inside it to be able to get that gray blue tone on the top side of the Spitfire. This grey blue tone is the base coat of the camo that is going to come up on the Spitfire, and it is the standard that was used by Indian Air Force Spitfires when they were transferred from the RAF. And here you can see me constructing thin layers of snakes that I call them, but this is actually blue tack and I'm using it to construct the borders of the camouflage that I'm going to paint on top of the Spitfire. And once all the masking of blue tack was done for the camouflage, I began painting the olive drab on top of the Spitfire. The trick to achieve that excellent camo is to remove the needle cap of the airbrush, bring it really close, roughly about 4 to 5 mm or max 1 centimeter away, compressor set at 10 to 12 psi, and spraying it really close with extreme concentration, a steady hand, and always ensuring to spray within the borders of the masking. It was a lot of work indeed. So while the camo was drying, I began painting the tips of the propeller blades with Camlin yellow, and you can see me painting the tips here. The propeller is currently mounted on top of a toothpick to help me with a 360-degree maneuverability with the propeller. And finally, it was time to remove the masking after the camo had been drying for 24 hours. And here you can see me removing all the blue tack. Now, the good part of blue tack is 1, it leaves no residue, and 2, it sticks to itself. So that helps the removal in a very easy manner. And finally, I masked off the exhaust pipes and then dry brushed silver onto the exhaust cylinder pipes. Finally, it was time to polish off the entire aircraft, and I used my car dashboard polish, and this gives a very nice sheen on top of the model. So I used a soft cloth and applied it liberally all over the model and just kept buffing it into the surface till the entire surface of the Spitfire began shining. And finally, it was time to add the Della Rowney gloss varnish on top of it to seal the entire paintwork. I usually add the varnish with a paintbrush, and this is a wide bristled paintbrush and it works very well. And finally, once all the gloss varnish had dried, it was time to add the decals. So I used my Indian Air Force decals from Bright Spark, and I used my standard procedure of applying decals, which is to add watered down PVA glue to the place where the decals would go, and then dipping the decal in warm water for about 30 to 45 seconds, sliding the decal off with a soft brush from the decal sheet, and then cleaning up the excess with a cotton Q-tip. This is also the first time that I tried printing decals at home, and I must say they came out really nicely and they've just added on to the look of the model. Finally, it was time to add a little bit of weathering, and I used the Camel Soft Pastels to weather the Spitfire. I used a dark brown color and scraped a little bit of it from the dark brown chalk into a small container. added a few drops of water to thin down the chalk and created a regular wash, and then added a few drops of dishwashing liquid. Now dishwashing liquid helps to break the surface tension of water and helps the wash to flow within the panels, as you will see shortly. So then I started a little bit of pin wash in the panel lines, and in other places I liberally applied it, but I wanted to keep the weathering really subtle, so I didn't go for some heavy weathering. And now you can see here how that wash is literally just traveling on its own because of capillary action inside the panels. And that's the advantage of using a dishwashing liquid. Finally, when the wash had been drying for 15 to 20 minutes, I used a damp paper towel to wipe off the excess wash. And finally, it was time to remove the masking from the canopy. And here you can see how beautifully the canopy of the Spitfire has turned out. There were still some issues inside the canopy paint, so I just touched up with a little bit of olive drab. And the last step, but not the least, was to add or glue the canopy on top of the Spitfire, add the wheels and the undercarriage and all the other stuff. And here it is, the completed Spitfire Mk.VIII of the Indian Air Force. And as you can see, it has come out really nice. This is my first 1/48 scale Spitfire build and my first ever 1/48 Model 2. And I must say I really enjoyed building it. If you liked my video, click on the thumbs up and subscribe to it. Thank you very much for watching, ladies and gentlemen. I will see you again real soon.